Hi everyone, Kurt here again, and today I'm going to be talking about teaching listening. And remember, this is teaching listening in a communicative based classroom. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is integrated instruction. And we're going to talk about this with all the skills listening, speaking, reading, writing, but I want to talk a little bit more since listening is the first one. So, in a communicative based classroom, it's important that we try to not think about separating the skills by themselves. So, even though we're talking about listening today, you want to integrate listening with other skills. In the real world, there's two things that we know for sure. It's really hard to just use one skill. Think about that. Is it possible for you to just listen without any kind of reading or writing or speaking? Not too often. Sometimes, of course, podcasts, music, things like that. But how about in communication? And we know that most listening tasks that you do in the classroom, they will involve other skills because we always want to do some kind of assessment, right? So when students talk, when students listen, we always want them to show us that they understood. And so we will ask them to write something or circle something or say something. So it's important that we think about teaching the skills in a way where it's not just listening, but it's listening and speaking, or it's listening and writing. Try to connect skills together. And often we want some kind of output, not just input skills. Okay. So what are the advantages? We know that production and reception, these two skills are connected. We know that interaction involves both sending and receiving messages. It's more authentic, right? Because you're using multiple skills at one time, just like outside of the classroom. And we also know that one skill often reinforces another. So the more you improve your listening, the more you actually improve your speaking. All right, so what do we know about listening comprehension in terms of research done? And the first thing I want to talk about is some myths. So there are 6 listed here that we should be careful about. The first one is that listening is a passive skill, which is not true. Actually, it's a very active skill. It's just you can't see the process because no one can see inside of your brain. There's a lot of things going on inside. And not only that, we usually have some kind of reaction while we're listening. Listening is a one-way process. This is also not true. Listening is an individual process. Not necessarily true. You are connected with somebody, right? Someone is talking to you. You are listening, but you're also aware of their presence. Even when you're listening to a podcast, even though you're listening, there are many things happening. There are people that you're listening to. Listening skills are acquired subconsciously. It's not necessarily true. You can practice them and you can have strategies that will improve your listening. Listening equals comprehension. You should know that this is not true. Just think of this very simple example. How many people have you talked to, and when you're done talking, they look at you and say, huh? What did you just say? They knew you were talking, they could hear your words, but they weren't actually focused on the words that you were saying, and so they didn't understand. And then the last one is that listening and speaking should be taught separately, and as I mentioned before, it's just not true. These two should be connected together. Okay, so here are some questions that you should be thinking about and we will discuss in class. So what are listeners actually doing when they listen? What affects good listening? What are the characteristics of real life listening? What are the many things that listeners actually listen for? What are some principles for designing listening techniques? How can listening techniques be interactive? And what are some common techniques for teaching listening? So these are things that we should be talking about, thinking about as we go through the content. All right, so here's an interactive model of listening comprehension. And what we're talking about here is the actual listening comprehension process. These are the things that are happening when you listen, when your students listen. So you're decoding auditory sounds. You're determining the function of the speech event, especially if it's not a video and you're just listening to audio. You're activating your schemata, which is your background knowledge. You're assigning literal meanings to what you hear, and you're also assigning intended meanings. So, what are the words that the person said? And then what is the actual meaning of those words? You're determining the demand for short or long-term memory. So do I need to remember it or can I let it go? And then you're retaining the essential information or meanings that you need depending on the purpose of why you're listening. Okay, so when we're talking about listening, of course, we are listening to people talk or sing or whatever. Now, what are the different types that we can use? And we can lump them into two major categories. The first one is monologues, and the second one is dialogues. Now, of course, there are many different types of these, but in general. Now, of course, for teaching, you should be offering both. And also, you can think about in terms of interaction in the classroom. You can have students do monologues and the other students listen, or you can do dialogues together. Okay, so what we should be thinking about, excuse me, from the teacher's perspective is, okay, so I want to help my students improve their listening. Well, first you need to think about why is that difficult for students? What makes it difficult? So before you keep watching, you should stop and think about that for yourself. What are the factors that make listening so hard? Okay, so I'll go through them right now. The first is clustering. As we know in English, we cluster consonants together. Now, common ones you learn in class will be like this: FR, fra, BL, blah, GR, gra. These are what we call consonant clusters. STR, stra, like that. But in English, as you know, words are also connected together, and any word that ends with a consonant and begins with consonants, those are also clusters, and you have some very different ones. Take the word robot flowers, for example, if that's such a thing. Robot ends with T, flowers begins with FL. So actually, the cluster here would be TFL. It's fla, robot flowers. So this is hard for learners because when they learn it at first, they usually learn the words like this: robot flowers. But when we put them together and you hear those clusters, it can throw students off. Okay, second one is redundancy. When we're listening to authentic speech, a lot of words and phrases are actually redundant, so students have to figure out what is actually important and what isn't. We have reduced forms, like I am going to the park, I'm gonna go to the park. Performance variables, so when you're listening to authentic speech, again, things happen. You forget what you're saying, you repeat yourself, things like that. If it's authentic language, again, there could be colloquial language, that's maybe slang, or language that's only used in that certain situation. So when you watch a movie, maybe an American movie, and you turn off the subtitles, there's a lot of things maybe you're not really sure what they're saying because it could be not formal but colloquial language. Okay, the rate of delivery, how fast the speaker is talking. Things like stress and rhythm and intonation can be tricky. And of course, interaction. Interaction is tough even in your first language when you're interacting with someone and you're expected to listen and understand and also respond. Okay, now, this is for your reference only. Sorry, get my face out of there. Every skill that we're going to talk about, listening, speaking, reading, writing, maybe grammar and vocabulary as well, we have what's called the micro skills and the macro skills. And another way to think about this is your micro skills are at, well, the micro level, or what we call the bottom up level. So it's where we're really focusing on specific parts of the language. So I'm not going to read them all. You can pause it and look at this at your own pace. But for example, if you look at number 1, retain chunks of language of different lengths in your short-term memory. Number 2, discriminate among the distinctive sounds of English. So these are the micro skills of listening. And then on the next page, I have the macro skills. So these are more top-down approach type skills, and these are a little bit more challenging in that you need to maybe have a better proficiency in listening. So, for example, look at number one, recognize the cohesive devices in spoken discourse, and so on. There are a few on the page, so you can go through them. What's important about these is that when you are teaching and testing your students, all of them should be included. Now, not all of them at the same time, but it shouldn't only be the micro skills. You should be considering the macro skills as well. The textbooks may or may not do it, so this is something that you might have to do on your own. Okay, moving on. Oops. Okay, so what are the different types of listening performance that you can ask your students to do in the classroom? Okay, I have 6 listed on the screen here, and I'm going to go through each one, try to give a definition and maybe some simple examples. Okay, so the first one is reactive. So basically, in reactive listening, you want students to simply listen to the surface structure of the utterance for the sole purpose of repeating it back to you. So like your choral or individual drills focusing on pronunciation. The GEPT elementary level listening test has this as part of the listening. They say a sentence, you have to repeat it. Okay, the next one is intensive listening. So here, students are required to single out certain elements of spoken language. So for example, they listen for cues in some choral or individual drill. The teacher repeats a word or a sentence several times to imprint it in the student's mind. The teacher asks students to listen to a sentence or a longer stretch of discourse and notice a specified element, like listen for the intonation. Is it rising or falling? Listen to the stress. Which word gets the most stress, or which syllable is stressed? Listening for a contraction or a grammatical structure. But can see the point here is you're listening to English or whatever the language is, but you're trying to find one specific part. So this is more like a micro skill. Okay, the next one is responsive listening. So now actually students need to have some outputs. So it's a little bit more interactive. So these are designed to elicit some immediate response, not delayed, and students process the teacher talk immediately and offer an appropriate response. So here it could be asking questions, giving commands, seeking clarification, or checking comprehension. Many, many, many different types of examples could fit in there. Okay, the next type is selective listening. So here students are required to scan the text for certain information. They're required to find important information that's mixed in with unimportant or distracting information. And in this, how this one is different from the previous ones is that now the discourse is longer. So you're listening to like a speech, a media broadcast, a story or an anecdote, or some conversations. Now these are like your typical English proficiency test items, where you listen to 2 people have a conversation and then they ask you some question like, what time did they go to the party, or what was he wearing, or things like that. So you have to listen very carefully and hear that specific information in a much longer text. Okay, so information that we could be asking for in this type of selective listening tasks. You could be asking their names, dates, facts or events, location, situation, main idea, conclusion, things like that. Okay, the next type is extensive listening. So this one is a little bit more for students who have maybe a better proficiency in English. This is your top-down global understanding of the spoken language. So extensive performance can involve, for example, listening to a lecture or other impromptu teacher monologues, so like academic listening. And students will be asked to do something like take notes, ask questions, have a discussion. These are the type of tasks where they listen to something long, and then maybe you ask them to do some critical thinking or solve a problem based on what they heard, or give a summary or something like that. Okay, and then of course we have interactive listening. Now, interactive listening could include all or any of the previous 5 types. just make it interactive. So now they perform in like a discussion or a debate or a conversation or a role play, pair and group work. But basically, now we're adding speaking, right? You're not just listening, but you're also responding to what we call an interlocutor, the person that you are having a conversation or discussion with. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the principles for teaching listening skills. These are, no, it doesn't matter what type of listening you're doing, what type of task you have the students do, these you should consider all the time. I think there's a few of them, 8 or 9 or something like that. Okay, the first one is you should always include a focus on listening in an integrated skills course. So basically, if the name of the course is English, you should have listening inside, not just focus on reading and grammar. You need to use stimulating and motivating techniques. Try to use as much authentic language and authentic context as possible. If you simplify the language too much, or you use these kind of what we call prepared dialogues, they don't have any mistakes in them, it's very clean, it copies the same structures they use in the book. Of course it can help their listening, but it's not going to help them to step out of the classroom and listen. Okay, you should be including pre, while, and post listening techniques. So it can't just start with, okay, everybody ready? We're gonna listen to this and you circle the answer. You have to do something first. Some kind of brainstorming or question to activate their background knowledge, something that comes before they actually listen. And then when they listen, what are they doing? Are they circling something? Are they taking notes? Are they drawing a picture? There should be something going on while they listen. And then after the listening is done, what are they going to do with that information that they just listened to? So every time you teach listening, you should include these 3. Okay, you should always carefully consider how the listeners are going to respond. Encourage the development of listening strategies, and I'm going to share some strategies later on. Maybe some students just don't know how to get better at listening, so that's your job, is to point them in the right direction. Have bottom-up and top-down listening techniques. So those are what I talked about before, the micro and macro skills. Okay, sorry, 7 only, not 8 or 9. All right, so here are some guidelines now for determining a listener's comprehension. Now, comprehension is a tough thing to think about. If I ask you to define what it means to comprehend something, it's not so, for me, it's not so clear. It's not so black and white because there are many levels of comprehension. But the problem with a teacher trying to determine a student's comprehension is that how do you know for sure how well they comprehend, especially if you're doing it in the foreign language? So you ask a student to you ask a student to listen to something and then you have them respond in some way. But what if their speaking in English is not very good? They actually could comprehend what they heard in the audio file, but perhaps they just don't have the ability to talk. Or maybe at the time they were listening, they could understand, but 5 minutes later, they already forgot because maybe their memory's not good or they were distracted. So here are some guidelines to try to help determine what their comprehension is. So you can, and I have some action verbs here. So the first one is doing, and we call this TPR. So they respond physically to a command. With beginners, it's easy. Okay, everybody stand up. They stand up. Okay, they comprehended what you asked them to do. The second is choosing. So students hear something, they select something. Okay, third type is transferring. For example, you hear something, you draw a picture. You hear something, you complete the map. You hear something, you fill in the missing boxes. You're transferring what you heard onto some kind of paper, picture, anything actually. Okay, we have answering. So of course, you listen, you answer the question. Condensing, so you take a lot of information and you condense it into an outline, or you take notes or a summary like that. And then extending. So you hear something and then you add on to it or continue it on. Like, for example, provide an ending to a story that you heard. Duplicating. So translate it into Chinese or your native language. Modeling. So you order a meal after listening to a model order. So you hear somebody do it and then you do it yourself. Okay, and the last one is conversing. So you engage in a conversation that indicates the appropriate processing of information. Okay, moving on. So here are the strategies that I mentioned earlier. Remember, it is your responsibility as a teacher to help your students find those listening strategies. Oh, and something I forgot to mention. Maybe your students already have those strategies in their native language. But that doesn't mean they transfer into learning English. They may forget or not even know how they really did it while learning their native language, which in our case is Mandarin Chinese, right? So this is something you have to help them. And every student could have strategies that help and different strategies that don't help, and they will be different for every student. So you have to really get to know who your students are. All right, so now we're talking about listening comprehension, right? So teach them how to listen for keywords, nonverbal cues to meaning. So when somebody shouts, somebody has rising intonation, what does that mean? Things like that. You look at their face, things like that. Predicting their purpose by the context of the discourse, associating the information with one's existing cognitive structure. So trying to make that connection between what I already know and what I'm hearing. Guessing at meanings. If you don't know, guess based on what you've heard. Teach them how to be good guessers. Seek clarification. Okay, so this is what I heard. I need to make sure if I really understood it or not. Ask the teacher, ask a classmate. Teach them how to listen for the gist. It should always be listen for the gist first, and then they listen a second time for the details. Teach them how to do test-taking strategies when we're talking about listening. Okay, so very, very briefly at the very end here, I'm going to talk about assessment. Later on, we're going to have another section on assessment. So I'm going to do this very briefly and just offer some very simple suggestions or examples. But what we should be thinking about is, first of all, assessment should be done every lesson. That doesn't mean give them a test. It means formative assessment. You should always be assessing their listening, which is why you should speak English to them as much as possible. Because if you are using English and they are using English, you can assess their listening very simply when you say to them, "Are you finished?" Huh? That means they don't understand what you're saying, right? You should constantly be interacting with them and checking their listening ability. Okay. Of course, you should give them tests once in a while, not all the time, but sometimes. And most of the tasks you do with them, try to have some kind of listening performance in there as well. Okay, so here's some examples just based on the different types. I'm not going to go through each one. These are for your reference. I'll just talk about maybe the first couple. So remember, intensive listening. If you forget, go back and look at what the definition is for that. But a couple examples is you can do distinguishing phonemic pairs, like the teacher says, or you hear an audio track that says grass, and they have to circle grass. If they hear glass, they circle glass. Or it could be vowels. So first one's consonant clusters, second one's vowels, leave and live. Or it could be distinguishing morphological pairs. So do they hear the ED or not? Distinguish stress patterns. I can go, I can't go. Things like that. Okay. The next one would be responsive listening tasks. So again, these are listen for specific information, remember? So the question will be, what time is it? And it's a multiple choice response. So they listen to something, oh, today it is Saturday and it is 1:30 p.m. The students hear a simple sentence like that, and then the question asks, what time is it? And they circle. Or it could be an open-ended response that they have to write down. And it could be simple discourse sequences like hello, nice weather, things like that. Okay. Selective listening tasks. So these are listening to longer stretches, remember? So it could be like listening close, verbal information transfer, picture cued information transfer. These are the ones that I talked about before. Chart completion, complete the map, draw a picture, things like that. Or sentence repetition. Okay, and then we have extensive listening tasks. So this could be dictation, it could be listening to the dialogue, lecture. You can see all of the different ways to test them. They have an open-end response, could be multiple choice, it could be summarizing, things like that. Okay, and that's it. All right, so thank you for your attention, everybody, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.